Well, this should be easy. Oh. Uh-oh. Let me ask you a question. Have you tried the most recent Spiral Abyss yet? How did it treat you? I personally found this to be a fair bit more difficult than previous Abyss cycles. So much so that I decided to make a video on it. That being said, the goal of this video is to go over Floor 11 and 12 in some detail, how one could decide on what teams and characters they can use, and finally, go over the teams that I used to get my 36 stars in this Abyss cycle. Also, as not everyone has access to the same characters as everyone else, I will often be speaking in broad terms for how you might think about how to handle an individual situation, as well as general, well-known team comps I'd recommend for each scenario. First we have Floor 11, which is normally not overly difficult, especially when compared to Floor 12, but this time around I found that it was a fair bit more challenging than usual. When dealing with Floor 11, as a general tip, you can usually get by with just using your strongest characters and teams to push your way through it. But when that is not an option, here's how you can think about each chamber individually. Chamber 1. Given that this is the first chamber, this shouldn't be too difficult, but let's talk about it. In the first half, you're looking at a couple of fairly high health enemies. Single target damage generally works best, or small focused area of effects also work very well. When you see enemies like the lava trolls, you also know that there's going to be a shield involved. You can sometimes just overpower the shield, but it's worth keeping in mind since if you do manage to break it, it will speed up your run significantly. Cryo and Pyro characters can get through that shield fairly easily. The team that I used was a Dia National team, but any variant of the National team will absolutely bully this chamber. For the second half of this chamber, you will be dealing with Hydro Mimics, many of which are flying, so range is a necessity. You also see Hydro Abyss Mages, so having a good element for getting rid of that shield is important. Something of note here is that you will want some option for AoE to deal with the Hydro Mimics since they like to come in swarms, but some crowd control effects, namely Animo ones, don't work on them particularly well. For this chamber, Electrocharge teams, Freeze, or Monocryo teams, or any form of Dendro-based team all do wonders. I personally used a Lisa-based Hyperbloom team here, but any team that can deal with the birds will do as well. Some general tips for dealing with the flying enemies is that bows are generally your best friend. That would be Fischl, Diona, Ganyu, just to name a few examples. But there are other well-suited characters for this as well that can still hit the birds, even if it seems like they shouldn't be able to. Nahida, Kazuha, or even Lisa can work. Starting Chamber 2, we again find ourselves faced down by a small group of large, high-health enemies, making single-target focused characters very strong here, such as Yoimiya or Hu Tao. Keep in mind that these Ruin-type enemies are highly resistant to physical damage. Trying to avoid using physical teams is generally a good idea. My Dia National team worked wonders here. However, any Vaporized team, a Mono Elemental team, or even Freeze teams can all work very well. This is more of a damage check than anything else. In the second half is where we face down our first appearance of the new enemy type, the Hilichurl Rogue. The rogues are high health mobs with both ranged and melee attacks, and from my experience, they hit very hard. They also take about half damage from their element, meaning in this case, it would be wise to avoid using teams that focus on those damage types. In other words, having those elements are generally fine, and even good in most cases, but say using a Wanderer to try and deal with the Animo Rogue may not be in your best interest. Other than the rogues, there are Geovishaps, which generally like to stay on top of you, so you shouldn't have to worry too much about them. Just bring your best non-Animo and non-Hydro main DPS, and you should be just fine. My Hyperbloom team was more than capable here, though Freeze, Taser, or any variant of the National team also would have worked. Chamber 3. Finally, for Chamber 3, there's a bit of a change. We're now dealing with a somewhat large group, so having area damage available will be extremely valuable. The first thing I cannot stress enough for this floor is do not bring a shield character. Getting hit by a Black Serpent Knight while you have a shield active can be a death sentence. They all have powerful abilities that are only activated when they hit a shield, including their own shields, ways of preventing you from dealing damage, powerful counterattacks, and even additional movement abilities. In other words, shields are not your friends in this chamber. As for the samurai enemies, all you need to know is that to achieve a good time when dealing with them is that they need to be killed in about the same time to prevent the other one from healing. This is probably common knowledge for most players at this point, but I felt it was still worth mentioning. My DIA national team had no issues here, but a freeze team honestly may have been better suited for this sort of challenge. Now for our last chamber of floor 11. Thankfully we have a very straightforward floor, with some Fatuis and a pair of Mirror Maidens. This is easily the most straightforward floor so far, though I have a couple of things that you should take note of that may help. First, the first wave of Fatui can all be taken down before they're able to get their shields up, but if you're not confident in your ability to do so, make sure you focus down the Hydro Gunner Fatui first, as once he starts healing, it can be a miserable time. As for the Mirror Maidens, for those who don't know, they are actually vulnerable to crowd control and even being interrupted, until they manage to land a hit on you. Even if you use invulnerability frames to avoid the damage, it will still count. My Hyperbloom team made quick work of this floor, though any team that can burst down a single target very quickly also does very well. Now we move on to the meat and potatoes of most Spiral Abyss runs, floor 12. This floor was pretty rough this time around, but weirdly enough, it wasn't the later chambers, it was the first one. Not saying that the rest wasn't challenging, but that the first floor was absolutely devastating by comparison. So let's talk about it. Chamber 1. Chamber 1 is our first introduction to the new consecrated beasts in the Abyss, the Dendro and Hydro types, and they are nasty. The damage they deal makes them extremely punishing, managing to mince their way through even the hardiest of shields. Your dodge timing will be put to the test here. My biggest piece of advice that I can offer is to be patient. This may take several attempts if you're trying to get all 3 stars out of this chamber. However, even before the beasts spawn, you will need to take down a group of ruined monsters that will thankfully stay pretty close to one another. Any fairly bursty AoE damage is welcome here. Some general advice for the beasts is that they will eventually drop some kind of elemental orb. If you can deal the matching element once, or several hits of any other element, you can absorb it and give yourself bonus damage on your next hit to that beast, and knock it down, taking away some of the pressure off yourself. On this floor, I found some success with Burgeon teams, Freeze teams, but the one I ultimately found to be the big winner was a Mono Geo team starring Noelle. As a final note, of the 2 beasts, the Dendro one seems to be the more aggressive of the 2, so if you stay near the other beast, you will usually be close to both of them at the same time, as the Dendro one will naturally follow you. The second half, on the contrary, I found so few options in my current roster that could actually handle this well. You have to deal with 2 small groups of enemies, the second of which have a pair of Kairagi, leading into 2 more consecrated beasts. This chamber was an absolute nightmare. This is the part that took me so long to get my 36 stars in this Abyss cycle. I cannot imagine this being doable in time without some way of grouping enemies, like using Sucrose or Kazuha, or even maybe Yelan. Teams that can go through their damage very quickly are very valuable here, since you need to be able to clear the 2 earlier waves quickly, and then be able to jump right back into fighting the beasts. Of my roster, the only team that I found that could handle this was an Ayaka Freeze team. I just need everything to stay still for me so I could burst them down. Similar to the previous chamber, staying near the Electro Beast and letting the Dendro Beast come to you is advantageous. But be ready to retry again, and again, and again. And don't worry about the blood, sweat, and tears while doing this chamber, it is a natural reaction. Another quick note that I really wanted to add here in particular is don't be afraid to do multiple runs, and cater your teams to each individual floor. It may help you quite a bit, especially on these more challenging chambers. Skill, Burst. Okay, one of them is not in range, but he should jump into it. He jumps into it, only takes a couple hits, not good enough. Okay, his thing got popped. Oh my god, oh my god. Hold your breath. Oh my god, I got it! Oh my... Chamber 2. Now onto a, by comparison, much more relaxing chamber. But not by much. We get started with a boss fight against the Aeon Blight Drake that will immediately take to the air. If you want to get this down in any reasonable time, you will need a bow character to shoot at its weak points on its wings, to knock it down to the ground. These are your big damage windows. Your chance to really lay down the hurt. Single target damage is also really good here. A mechanic worth taking note of here is that the Drake will gain elemental resistance against your primary damage if it is allowed to stay in the air for too long, but once you knock it down, you have nothing to worry about. Honestly, this is more or less a giant health bar that flies. My 3-star run of this was with a mono cryo team, but any team with good single target would work here as well, such as Hyper Bloom or a Hu Tao or Yoimiya vape teams, just to name a few. The second half can be a bit hard to get down in time for a 3-star run. Firstly, you have to deal with 3 Hydro Rogues. Compared to the Animo Rogues, they do group up a bit easier, but you'll still want a way to pull them together if possible. Other than that, they are pretty easy to deal with. Just try not to rely too much on Hydro damage to deal with them. After that, you'll be faced down with a slightly more complicated problem. Several Eremites, 2 of which of those are summoners, on opposite ends of the room, a Pyro one and an Animo Archer. This is where what I've been calling strategic grouping comes into play. Since most of the enemies are melee, with the exception of the summoners, you'll want to let them come to you. I have noticed that the Pyro Summoner will eventually teleport to your position, or relatively close to it, if you focus your attention on the Animo Archer. Beyond that, just keep in mind that while their summons are active, the summoners take reduced damage and are even stunned once the summon is destroyed. My Dia National team handled this floor very well, but a Taser team or Freeze team also would have sufficed. Generally speaking, any team that can handle fairly large groups is a good go-to. Chamber 3. Now to the final chamber, and we start off against another boss fight. This time against good old Simon. This mechanical monstrosity is fairly healthy, and has a really annoying mechanic that needs to be dealt with. It turns invisible every so often. While it is invisible, it also takes significantly reduced damage, even if you can figure out where it is. However, there is a way to break its stealth early, simply by finding it and quickly hitting it with any electro reaction. My go-to was Hyper Bloom for a fast kill. But Spread, Aggravate, Electrocharge, Overload, all of these work as well. You can build your team around an Electro reaction, or simply make sure that one is available and you should be a-okay. Just bring your best boss killing team and an Electro unit and this should be fairly easy. And finally, possibly everyone's favorite returning Abyss boss fight, the Magu-Kenki triplets. Each one having an attack of the Magu-Kenki. A Cryo Explosion that leaves behind a damaging AoE effect, Animo range slashes, and a ranged mask attack. Most of these are fairly easy to avoid, with the exception of the Cryo Explosion. The ice it leaves behind is very damaging, and if you plan on getting 3 stars, you will most likely need to heal your way through that damage. Characters like Kokomi and Chi-Chi are actually pretty good at this. Some general tips is that you usually want them to die around the same time, simply for the timer's sake. When the fight starts, going after the Cryo Triplet first will usually have the other 2 approach you for optimal AoE damage. And if you need to focus one down, have it be the Cryo one. That way you can focus more on damage over survivability. My team of choice was a Kokomi-driven Taser team, which made quick work of them, but a Bloom-based team also would have done very well. In conclusion, these are just the ways that I dealt with the Abyss this time around, and some general tips to help you in tackling the Abyss. There are other teams and other ways of dealing with each of these situations beyond what I have laid out here, so don't be afraid to experiment using this as a starting off point. So I hope anyone watching found this helpful, and maybe I helped just at least one person get an extra star or two in the Abyss. If you enjoyed or found this helpful, please leave a like, and if you think I earned it, subscribe for more. If this video is well received and people like it and find it helpful, I may revisit this topic every time there's major Abyss changes, and if people want me to, I'd also like to put together a more general video going over how I make these decisions when I'm first putting together new teams for an Abyss run. Anyway, that's all for me. Cheers.